All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the Green Growth Knowledge Platforms webinar. My name is Benjamin Simmons and I serve as the head of the GGKP Secretariat. The GGKP was founded a few years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank, and has since expanded to a global partnership of over 40 leading international organizations, universities, and think tanks. These partners share a common belief that mobilizing a green economy transition requires that policymakers, practitioners, and experts have access to cutting-edge knowledge and data to support their efforts. With this mandate in mind, the GGKP focuses on two main sets of activities. The first is to work with our partner institutions to identify and address major knowledge gaps in green growth theory and practice. And the second is to identify, gather, and share green growth knowledge and data with the growing community of practice. As part of these activities, the GGKP is hosting a Green Growth webinar series with thanks to the generous financial support from Germany's GIZ and the Swiss government. This webinar is the fifth in our series and will focus on a recently released World Bank report entitled Shockwaves: Managing the Impacts of Climate Change on Poverty. Before introducing our moderator for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then report them to all of the participants for our panelists to address during the question and answer period. We will be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and I would encourage you to complete it as this provides us feedback to help shape our future webinars. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org, and we will help you to troubleshoot. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Carlo Carraro. Carlo will be well known to many of you. He is a professor of environmental economics and econometrics at Ca' Foscati University of Venice, where he served as president from 2009 to 2014. He also serves as vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3. He is director of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Program at FEAM and director of the International Center for Climate Governance. Finally, Carlo serves as the co-chair of the GGKP Advisory Committee, and we feel quite fortunate to have Carlo moderate today's webinar. And so, Carlo, it is now my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Hello, thank you, Ben, and welcome all of you, or all of those who are listening to our webinar today. I'm quite glad to introduce this webinar for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I'm the co-chair of GGKP Advisory Board, and we're trying to stimulate a diffusion of knowledge across all over the world about the contents of our research and the research of our partners. And of course, this is a great occasion. This webinar is a great occasion to do it. There is a second reason. Today's webinar is going to focus on a crucial issue in international climate policy, and this is the link between climate change, development, and poverty. It is clear that there is an impact of climate change on poverty. It is clear that this impact is more and more important in many regions of the world, and it's also clear that solutions to climate change, measures and policy that addresses climate change, are also very important to reduce poverty, to solve the poverty problem. Probably this is one of the reasons, probably the main reasons why countries participating in the next COP21 have decided to submit pledges to reduce their own emission reductions, their own greenhouse gas emissions. The reason is quite simple. Even developing countries who have been reluctant in the past to adopt these measures because they're concerned with development issues now understand that climate change is a threat to development, and solutions to climate change are an incentive, are beneficial, are important measure that will help to reduce poverty worldwide. So this kind of twofold links between climate change and climate change policy and poverty is really at the heart of the pledges that many developing countries have submitted to the Paris conference. And indeed, we have now 161 countries that submitted their own emission reduction projects to the Paris conference. And many of these pledges, many of these commitments to reduce emissions deal with development and poverty issues and are focused, even in terms of collaboration between developed and developing countries, on addressing poverty and development. So this is certainly a timely and an important occasion to deal with this issue, and the report produced by the World Bank is also very, very timely and important, and its contents are really going to be useful to address this debate, and in particular to inform policy decision in the future. This is a crucial characteristic of GGKP. GGKP is not just a knowledge platform collecting ideas, results, papers, books, and so on and so forth on important topics on climate, environmental policy, green growth and development, and so on. It's also a platform that proposes solutions, that contains solutions, and I believe that today's webinar and the report by the Central Bank is both things at the same time. It's a careful analysis of the development and poverty problem and the influences of climate change on poverty, and on the other hand, it contains proposals for solutions, ideas for policy measures that can be implemented in many countries around the world. The report will be presented by Stephane Hallegatte. Stephane Hallegatte is one of the authors of the report. The report is of course the outcome of the work of a team. And Stephane, who is the senior economist at the World Bank and is working with the climate change group, will present, and he will have 20 minutes to present the report. After Stephane Hallegatte's presentation, we will have two discussants. One is Paul Ekins. The first one will be Paul Ekins, who is director at the Institute for Sustainable Resources of the University College London. And the second one is Simon Henderson, head of the Climate Change Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. So two great discussants for a great report, and I will really enjoy the presentation and discussion, but most importantly, this webinar is a good occasion for discussion among all participants. So look forward to receiving questions, and you know how then Ben Simmons just explained to you how to send comments and questions and remarks, and at the end, after by Stephane and the two discussants' comments, I will give you the chance to and I'll read the questions to interact with Stephane Hallegatte and the two discussants. So please send your questions. I'll follow all of them. I'll try to do it as much as possible, and then you will get a short and precise answer and comments from Stephane. So this is the format of the webinar. I look forward to listening to Stephane's presentation, and I would like to invite Stephane to start the presentation of the report.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you very much, Ben. I want to start by thanking you for organizing this seminar. I was lucky enough to be involved in the first steps of the GGKP a few years ago with Ben, and it's really a great opportunity for us to share our work and to try to get feedback. So I can only stress more the fact that we expect your questions and your comments and feedback. The goal of the presentation is not to deliver a presentation, but also to get your feedback and question and have a conversation on the results. So I hope everything is working well, that you see my screen and the slides of the presentation. I will start with just a little bit of background about why we decided to start this work, and it really started from a frustration about the work on the economic impact of climate change. Everybody has in mind that climate change will affect poor people more than the rest of the population. But even though most of the analysis of the economic impact of climate change focused on aggregates, so aggregate income, like the global income, which is what you find in the IPCC, an estimate of how much climate change might reduce global income, or even like national income or GDP. Problem with these metrics is that when you look at aggregate metrics, you're mostly looking at rich people. It's true at the global level. So on this slide, you see the share of various world regions in global GDP. And you see very well, whatever happens in Africa, you will not see it in the global income or global GDP. So when you're looking at global GDP, you're looking at North America, Europe, China, and other big players, but you don't see what's going on in Malawi. It's the same thing within countries. If you look at the distribution of income or distribution of wealth, in most countries, like 50% of the population does not really matter in global statistics. So if you're looking at climate change impact starting from national aggregates or global aggregates, you're not looking at poverty. And the problem is, what if the problem was much more the impact on the poorest than the impact on GDP? We would be missing this. So we really wanted to start this work not looking at the impact on the macroeconomy or the national economy and then the consequences on poverty, but doing exactly the opposite, starting with poverty, starting with poor people at the micro level, at the household level, really from the ground up. And there is another reasons why we wanted to do this study, is that you can still find people trying to oppose climate policies with poverty reduction and development. And we really think that climate change is a development issue, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to separate these and to oppose what's going on in poverty reduction and what's going on the climate side. So by looking at poverty and climate, we were looking for ways to bring these agendas together. So what I will do now is to go through the three main messages of this report. And the first message of this report is the fact that climate-related shocks and stresses are already an obstacle to the eradication of poverty, and that these obstacles will become worse because of climate change. So what's new in terms of methodology in this report compared with a lot of other studies is that we did not start from the national economy, but we started from households, and we did not start from projections from the future. We started by looking at what's going on now. To illustrate this, let me start with an example. This is about 36 villages in Andhra Pradesh, and this is a study following households over a 25-year period of time, looking at the dynamics of poverty. So looking at whether households are escaping poverty or falling back in poverty and so on over 25 years. And what's really interesting in the study is the finding that every year, 14% of the population of these villages is escaping poverty. So if poverty reduction was a one-way road, in just a few years, there would be no poverty anymore. Problem would be solved. Problem is, every year we have also 12% of the population falling back in poverty. So what we call poverty reduction is the difference between these two flows. It's this 2% per year reduction that we observe. But we have to keep in mind that this is just the balance between flows in and out. And it has very important implications, because if you imagine even a tiny change in the flow into poverty from 12 to 13%, this would cut the rate of poverty reduction by half. And if you have like a small change in the rate going out of poverty, same thing. Going from 14 to 13% is enough to divide poverty reduction by 2. And if you do the two things together, you don't have poverty reduction anymore. So even small changes in these flows can have a huge impact on the rate of poverty reduction. And now when we look at why people are falling back in poverty, why they are not able to get out of poverty, well, we find that climate is everywhere. So in that case, for instance, droughts, irrigation failure, and crop disease, all things which have a relationship with climate, are involved in 44% of the cases. And if you look at why people have trouble escaping poverty, you find that repeated weather events, that is destroying assets that poor people have to accumulate to escape poverty, are playing a big role. So this case is only one case. We have many others, but it illustrates really well the two important. We have to think about the flow in and out of poverty and not only about the net effect. And climate-related things are already, well, events, weather events, but also things linked with agriculture are already responsible for bringing people back in poverty or preventing people from escaping. When we look at not only this case, but many other household surveys looking at the same thing, we find that there are three main shocks that keep people in poverty. Spikes in food prices and shocks to agricultural income, natural disasters, drought, floods, storms, and health-related shocks, and especially malaria and diarrhea. And all of these three things are linked to climate. And in the report, we look at the three categories of shocks, looking at the latest projection on what will be the impact of climate change on these shocks. And we find that in most regions, these shocks will get worse. So doesn't mean it's the case everywhere. We find regions where things might be improved because of climate change. But if you look at the global level, really in most of the case, most of the regions, most of the categories of people, we find an increase in these shocks. This has like one very important implication for us. This is the fact that if we can do something about these shocks, and even if it's called climate change adaptation, and it's about building a dike, or it's about taking care of an increase in diarrhea, for instance, it's climate change adaptation, but it also contributes to poverty reduction. So that's one of the main findings of the report, that if we deal with these shocks, and many people will call that disaster risk management or climate change adaptation, we're doing poverty reduction. So there is no big difference between the two. One thing that we did in this report, which is also fairly new, is to really look at the numbers to see whether poor people are more affected by these shocks. So there is this common knowledge that poor people are more affected by all of these shocks, but very little evidence, hard evidence. So we did a lot of work, especially looking at 52 countries using DHS household surveys and combining these household surveys, socioeconomic information, with data on flood risks, drought risks, heat waves, and so on. And what we find is that indeed poor people are very often more exposed to all of these shocks. And just to take the case of Nigeria, for instance, we find that poor people in the bottom 20% are 50% more likely to be flooded every year, 130% more likely to be affected by a drought, and 80% more likely to be affected by extreme heat. This is one example, but we find that in many, many places. And one result which is really striking in Nigeria is when you try to link, and this is what is shown on the right-hand side, the hottest temperature in the year, and this is x-axis, with the wealth of the people living in one place, and you control with the size of the household and so on, what you find is almost a straight line, which means that in Nigeria, there is a sorting of people, with the poorest people living in the hottest place in the country and the richest living in the coldest place. And this finding we find in many, many places. And we're very confident in this result because if we look at cold countries, we find the opposite relationship, which suggests that poor people are living in more marginal area, places that are more at risk of any type of disaster. Just to illustrate our global results, here are three maps with the 52 countries we could look at, And each country in orange are countries where people, urban dwellers, people in cities, are more likely to be in the flood zone if they are poor. And countries in green, it's the opposite. Rich people are more often affected. And you see that, again, it's not everywhere, but in most countries we could look at, if you're poor, you're more likely to live in a place that is at risk, in that case of flood. But what's really interesting is not only to look at how likely it is to be affected. What's more interesting is to look at how much people lose when they are affected. And here we have a few case studies. They are shown here on this graph. It compares the fraction of assets that people lose after a flood, depending on whether they are poor people or non-poor people, so the bottom 20% versus the rest of the population. And here we find that poor people are losing much more when they are affected. In Mumbai, for instance, after the 2005 floods, poor people lost between 2 and 3 times more of their assets than non-poor people. And we look at the reasons why, and we find that first, there is a portfolio issue. Rich people have savings in forms that are not vulnerable. Bank accounts cannot be flooded. Poor people have all of their assets in vulnerable forms. In rural areas, it will be livestock that is very vulnerable to drought. In cities, it will be just their house that's really vulnerable to floods. So they don't have a portfolio that's diversified and virtual and protected. So they are losing more because all of their assets are vulnerable. And of course, also the quality of these assets are different. So rich people are more likely to live in fancy and nice houses with protections to floods. The typical house that you find in the slum can be completely washed out by a flood. This is not the case of the house of the rich. So there are really two issues, like composition of the asset portfolio and also the quality of these assets. And here I show houses, but poor people are also more likely to depend on roads which are not paved, so more vulnerable to floods, and so on and so forth. So we have to keep in mind, this is not only about how likely it is to be affected, it's also about how much I lose when I'm affected. And it's not only this, it's also when I'm affected and I've lost a lot, who will help me? And we're looking at remittances, support from friends and families, and support from the government. And we find that for all of these, poor people receive less support. So this is an example for Indonesia, for instance, looking at the access to financial institution, if you need to borrow to rebuild, for instance, and looking at the average transfer from social protection. And for these two things, we find that poor people receive less support than the non-poor. And if we go to Malawi, a country much poorer than Indonesia, we find that not only it's worse for the entire population, but we keep this pattern of poor people receiving less support and being less able to get help than the rest of the population. So this is something we really wanted to flag because everybody is talking about where people live and the fact that poor people are more at risk. We have to keep in mind also the composition of their portfolio and the support they receive, because these are things on which we can make a lot of policy proposals, and I'll get to that in a minute. So this first message is sort of depressing, right? So poor people are more exposed, so they will be affected more than the others. It confirms also our idea that if you look at GDP, you're missing something, because if poor people are more affected, you can imagine a scenario where GDP is not affected that much, but poor people suffer a lot. So it really asks for this research on the impact on poverty, and it really supports this idea that disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation are poverty reduction policies. We wanted to look at actions. What can be done? What can we do? So what we did is to look at what development can provide us. And this is the good news in the report. We find that good development, so development that's rapid, inclusive, so bring everybody in, and climate informed, can prevent most of the impacts of climate change on poverty. So good development can protect poor people. We also find that if we don't deliver this good development, then consequences can be very, very high, and we could add more than 100 million people in extreme poverty by 2030 just because of climate change. So let me get into the details of this. So we wanted in this report to start from the fact that the same event, so this is heavy precipitations, as you can see, will have a very different consequence if it affects a very poor neighborhood or a very rich city. And development can bring us any of those, right? So we wanted not only to look at the magnitude of climate change, but also how much development, how much capacity we have on the ground. To look at this question, we started with videos of how the world could evolve in the absence of climate change, being more or less optimistic on economic growth, poverty, inequality, and access to basic services like water and sanitation. So we have these two worlds that we could live in the absence of climate change, and then we add climate change in each of them. And by comparing the impact of climate change in the first or in the second world, we can look at what development can bring in terms of reducing. Find in 92 countries, so we could do this analysis in 92 countries. It's about 90% of the population in developing countries, but we're missing high vulnerability spots like small. And this is in the scenario where we have this good development, where development is rapid and inclusive and climate informed. And we find that climate change in 2030 would bring up to 16 million people in poverty, which is a relatively limited number, whereas like Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia being the most vulnerable regions. But this is really small compared with what happens in the other scenario, in which development is not very rapid, not very inclusive, and access to basic services remains limited in 2030. In that case, we find up to 122 million people in poverty just because of climate change. And we have this, again, these hotspots in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, this is where the impacts are felt. So again, we don't have all countries here, but we have this very strong finding that development can prevent a lot of these impacts and is an efficient way of avoiding impacts. So I will now try to look at what it means in terms of policy and what needs to achieve. So we're looking at the different sectors. First, agriculture and infrastructure, and we stress many things that you have heard before. We stress extents, we stress all of the tools you need to help farmers manage bad years and drought and floods and other disasters. We also stress the connection to markets. We find that people better connected to markets see less volatility in food prices and are less affected by local shocks. We're looking also at financial inclusion. For the reasons I mentioned before, it helps people save in a form that is safe and not vulnerable to natural disasters. It also helps people access borrowing after a shock and so on. So a lot could be gained from this. We also look at social protection, which we have an entire chapter in the report about social protection because we feel it's a really important thing. And we're looking at the portfolio of things that is required. So we don't believe very much in the one instrument that will protect people. We say that we need different instruments to cope with small events and with very intense events. And we also need different instruments to protect very poor people and richer people. And so we're going through the different instruments we have and trying to map this space to help design a protection system. So using remittances, social protection, and diversification to manage small shocks. Then using savings, credits, and the fact that remittances can increase after a shock for bigger events. But we know that this is mostly for the richer households. We know that market insurance can play a big role, but again, this is something mostly for rich people. So we discuss a lot what social insurance and safety nets can bring. And to help countries implement these safety nets and this social insurance, how the governments can manage the financial risk with contingent finance and international aid. So, I mean, I won't get into all of the details of the report, but we're really looking in much details into this social protection system. And we're also looking at healthcare and access to healthcare. And we're, for instance, discussing the case of Rwanda, which invested a lot in health insurance after '94. And today, more than 80% of the population is covered. So this is a good example of policies that can be implemented everywhere and really helps people cope with climate change. So at that point, you should be thinking, this guy is not really talking about climate change. He's talking about development. Where is climate change? I want to see what climate change brings. And if you think that, it means that we've been successful, because this is really what we tried to highlight. The fact that a lot of what we need to protect people against climate change is development. And a lot of policies and projects that the development community is doing, which has no relationship whatsoever with climate change, can be contributing to reducing climate change impacts. So if we build a dike to protect a village against floods, we're reducing the impact of floods and climate change on this community. But if we provide better primary education and we make these people richer and better able to use early warnings, for instance, maybe the education project never got labeled climate change adaptation, but in the end, it reduces climate change impacts. So we have to keep in mind that the broad development agenda is contributing to climate change, and that is the boundary between what we label climate change and what we label development is somewhat arbitrary, and we know that there are different places we could put the boundary, and we have to keep in mind that this is like a fuzzy transition between what we label climate and what we label development. In the report, we're not only looking at these very broad development strategies, we're also looking at very specific things. I won't get into the details, in part because I don't have time, and in part because I want you to read the full report. So I hope you will get into the details in the book. Just to give you an example, we're looking at R&D in the health sector going to the type of disease that you find in tropical areas and are likely to increase because of climate change. And it's less than 1% of R&D that's going in that direction in the world. So, I mean, investing more in what's happening in tropical regions, and that's likely to increase with climate change, is an obvious recommendation. That we have much more on this. So I realize I'm a bit slow, so I might just go through a few slides quickly, just to get to my third message, on which I will conclude. The third message is about the long term. And it really stresses the fact that as we are doing this development, as we are doing climate change adaptation and risk management, we also need to think about mitigation and reducing emissions, because that's the only way to reduce the long-term threat to poverty. And we look at in the report at how this can be done without threatening and slowing down poverty reduction, and we find that this can be done. So just to highlight the point about the short and the long term, all the estimates I discussed before, the 100 million people in poverty in 2030, is looking at the tiny green box here. The change in climate that we expect between 2000 and 2030. And here it's extracted from the IPCC, and you see on the y-axis it's the global temperature change. We're talking about a fairly limited change in climate compared with the orange box, which is going to 2100 and beyond, something much bigger. So when we say good development can prevent the impact of climate change on poverty by 2030, we're talking about something small. But there are limits to what development and adaptation can achieve, and this is why if you want to prevent the long-term impact, we cannot not reduce emissions and stabilize climate change. And when we're looking at the longer term, in the report we have a lot on agriculture, for instance. We find that climate change unabated might prevent the catching up of the poorest region. So on this slide you see the access to food in sub-Saharan Africa, and the green lines are the scenarios without climate change, and orange and red are optimistic and pessimistic estimates without any adaptation, so the 4-degree warming scenario. And you see that you can have the access to food in sub-Saharan Africa basically plateauing after 2050. And the level at which we find this plateau is 70–80% of access to food that we have in developed countries today. So what we find in this report is that climate change might really threaten the ability of poorest regions to converge and to access standards of living we have in rich countries today. So we need to stabilize climate change, and this is not a new finding. The IPCC has said a lot about it, but if we want to stabilize climate change, we need emissions to go to zero. So these slides show you the baseline emissions, CO2 emissions between now and the end of the century. Baselines are increasing or stabilizing. You want 3-degree stabilization, you want 2-degree stabilization, it doesn't really matter. Emissions have to go to zero. This is a challenge we face, and this is not a small challenge. So how can we do this without slowing down poverty reduction? This is what we look at in the report. Of course, we're looking at co-benefits, how this is an illustration on congestion in cities, for instance, how public transit can reduce emissions, but also make big cities more efficient and create more jobs and improve the quality of life. We look at air quality, we look at energy and water management, we look at cook stoves and cooking. There are many co-benefits. We have enough to keep us busy for a long time trying to capture all of these co-benefits. But to get emissions to zero, we cannot only do things with co-benefits. We will have to do things which are costly. And we look, for instance, at removing fossil fuel subsidies in 20 countries, looking not only at what are the consequences of removing the subsidy, but also what we can do with the money we save. And that's the same thing if you implement a carbon pricing scheme. It's not only about the impact of the carbon price, it's also what do we do with the resources we can raise with it. And we find that the impact on the poor depends mostly on what you do with the money. So here we show what happens if you take away $100 in fossil fuel subsidies and you redistribute it per capita in your country. And this is the average for 20 countries. We find that the 60% poorest in the country would benefit, and the bottom quintile would benefit the most. This is one way of introducing sort of energy pricing and using it to help poor people. This is what Indonesia did when they reformed their fossil fuel subsidies. In the report, we also look at how this could be used to invest in infrastructure that the poor can use, or how it can be used to finance education, for instance. We also say that if you look at the poorest countries, like the low-income ones, even if only rich people in these countries are affected, you have a problem because even the richest in these countries are poor. So we also flag the fact that even though redistribution within countries can go a long way, especially middle-income countries, if we're talking about the low-income countries, there is no way of reducing emissions in these countries without slowing poverty reduction if you don't have resources arriving from the international community. So there is a huge responsibility of the international community to help these people, especially to finance greener and better and more efficient infrastructure. So to conclude, I started with a very dark diagnostics, but I think this report has an optimistic takeaway. We have a window of opportunity between now and 2030 to achieve our objectives in terms of poverty reduction in spite of climate change. And we also know how to do it. And there are two pillars. There are the short-term impacts that cannot be avoided with mitigation. And for them, we have to invest in rapid, inclusive, and climate-informed development. We need social protection, we need health coverage, and we need targeted adaptation interventions like in flood management or agriculture. And there are the long-term impacts that cannot be avoided with adaptation and development. And for them, we need to start reducing emissions now. Middle-income countries can do a lot to redistribute internally to make sure poor people are not affected. And we show in the report how to do that. For the poorest countries that cannot do that internally, they will need international support. But there is nothing impossible in all of that. It just requires a lot of political will and a lot of work. And the next steps after this report is really to look country by country, well, with countries interested in doing this work with us, and trying to see how this global agenda can be translated into something that makes sense at local scale, taking into account the local context and the local priorities. It's very, difficult in global reports to explain what everybody can do. But there is a next step to this report, which is to go from the global analysis to more national level and context one. Thank you very much for your attention. I've been slightly longer than expected. Apologies for this. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephane. The presentation was excellent. Indeed, it was slightly longer than expected, and this is why I won't spend a single minute to comment on the presentation. Also, because we have a lot of questions coming in, and we want to get time to answer these questions. This is why I'm giving the floor immediately to our first discussant, Professor Paul Ekins, who is Professor of Resource and Environmental Policy at University College of London and Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. Paul, the floor is yours. Please try to stick to 8 minutes in order to catch up with the delay.
Yes, thank you, Carlo. And I will indeed stick to my allotted time and probably less than that. My remarks are going to be at a high level, really, because the enormous detail in this report, and it's a long report, is something obviously that I can't get into or second guess, not being a development practitioner. But I think that the high level messages are really important, and I want to stress those. I think perhaps Stephane did not stress them quite enough, and so that's why I want to dwell on those. I think the first main message, as Stephane said, is not a real surprise, that climate-related shocks will affect the poor most. I think one of the very important messages is that actually, as far as poor people are concerned, climate shocks have always been a major cause of concern, and that there is evidence that these climate shocks are becoming more frequent and more intense now, so that immediately climate change then stops being an issue for the future and becomes much more an issue for the present. And I think that is really important in the context of the negotiations that are coming up in Paris, because there has been, in my view, a very simplistic and indeed a mischievous discussion, as Stephane said, that tries to trade off poverty alleviation now for climate action for the future. And I think that one of the most important things this report does is that it shows that that is a completely wrong way of framing the issue. What we're talking about is climate-friendly development now in order to achieve sustainable poverty eradication for the future, but at the same time we're talking about mitigating the worst effects of climate change by immediate action, and we will not get the payoff for that, as was very clear, or we won't get the major payoff for that, as is very clear, until later in this century. But until unless that is done, then obviously poverty eradication is going to be something that goes very strongly in reverse. I think that that links very, very strongly with the Sustainable Development Goals, and along with many other people, I suspect, I was enormously encouraged by the ability of the global community to agree the SDGs in September this year, because it seems to me that that could mark a turning point in a turning back to multilateralism, away from the much more nationalistic agendas that many countries have been pursuing, perhaps even since the 1980s, and a recognition that the Sustainable Development Goals are something for all to achieve, and none of those, of course, is poverty eradication, and the linking of this poverty eradication to the climate debate seems to me to be a really important new development, which is one that I hope the Paris talks will be informed by and will do something to mitigate the suspicion and the uncertainty that exists, and I suppose to some extent between rich and poor countries. This is a genuinely common agenda, perhaps for the first time since the Brundtland report back in 1988, it can be seen as a genuinely common agenda, and I hope that that is a message that is fully taken on board. One of the details which I must say the report brought home to me, and I hadn't fully appreciated this before, was this very important point about net flows of poverty. I suppose, not having thought about it terribly deeply, I'd imagined that once you got out of poverty, you stayed out of poverty, but of course that is not true, as a moment's reflection would reveal, and that really quite fine balance between the proportions of people coming out of poverty and the proportions of people falling back into poverty, I think underscores the enormous importance of taking the poverty eradication agenda seriously and linking it to these climate impacts, because the climate impacts literally have the ability not just to halve the net numbers of people coming out of poverty, but indeed to put that whole process back into reverse. I think that's mainly what I'm wanting to say. I think the numbers in the report are extremely sobering. The difference between 16 million if we get climate resilient development and 100+ million people going back into poverty if we don't get climate resilient development, I think that is truly stark and astonishing. And when one thinks of the sorts of, in a sense, global problems that are being faced by numbers of people in migration, where they can't live any longer where they always used to live, we can see that those kinds of numbers, it would be quite impossible for any country to insulate itself from those sorts of flows were they to take place. So that's another, I think, another aspect that stresses the global and common nature of this problem. And I'm going to make one final remark here, and this really, I suppose, if it's not really a point of disagreement with Stephane, but I just think it was lovely, that last slide about the optimistic takeaway. I prefer to call it the hopeful takeaway, because I think hope is something that is something that it sort of springs eternal in humans, whereas optimism is kind of an evaluation of the probabilities. And it seems to me that in that focus on the poor countries, and Stephane saying that they would not be able to achieve climate-friendly development by themselves because some of the measures are too costly and therefore they would need international support. I think I would agree with that as stated, but what I would stress is that they are not very costly, these things. And one of the things which, as an environmental economist myself, I've been absolutely astonished by over the last 10 or 15 years is the speed with which low-carbon technologies of all kinds have been developing. And by developing, I mean coming down in cost, as well as becoming more effective. So that with each year, we find that these technologies are coming more within the reach of the poor, and that means, of course, that the programs of international support that will be required from richer countries are reduced and can be reduced. And it seems to me that that's an enormous important psychological factor, because no countries like to go on giving support and aid year after year with a perception that that's a kind of infinite commitment. But where we are now with the climate-friendly development trajectory, I think countries can foresee is that these needs for international support can actually be diminished because of the extraordinary speed with which these technologies are developing. And the last thing I will say is that if you take into account the co-benefits, and I was involved in a publication earlier this year by The Lancet on the global health benefits of tackling climate change, I think if you take account of the co-benefits, then actually all countries can experience net benefits from tackling climate change, both with this new economic dynamic from these new technologies, but also the co-benefits from health, from a healthier diet, from lower air pollution, from all sorts of things. And our report goes into that in a lot of detail. The problem, of course, is that a lot of those co-benefits at the moment are not monetized. They're externalities. and the IMF report on the global cost of fossil fuels was a very good example of that. By far the greatest costs of fossil fuel subsidies are the externalities, the subsidies that are not actually monetized. And that seems to me to emphasize the need of making apparent indicators beyond GDP so that it becomes very obvious to countries that even though it may be that their GDP is not growing as fast as it might have done, the other benefits that they're getting from climate-friendly development, which are not monetized, but which are reflected in health indicators, etc., these other benefits are actually much greater than perhaps the very small amounts of GDP growth which they may have foregone. So I think with that, I will close my comments. I too, like everyone else, am very interested to hear what questions have come in, and obviously if anyone wants to ask me any questions on the basis of what I've just said, I'll be very happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul. And I would like to give the floor to Simon Anderson, who is some way far in Africa, if I'm correct. Simon Anderson is the head of climate change group at the International Institute of Environment and Development. And given that we are late, I'll give him the floor immediately. Simon, please.
Thank you, Carlo, and I will be as brief as I can. It's great to be able to join this this webinar. This is a report that I've enjoyed enormously in the short time that it has been out, and it's something that has taught me a lot, and it's also corroborating some of the other work that's coming up related to this climate and poverty issue. I just want to mention in particular the ODI 00 report that's come out recently, and also IIED's work on radical adaptation. All these three bodies of work will be on the table at the Development and Climate Days on the middle weekend of the Paris Conference of Parties for those that want to come. I note in the report that some of the climate cliches have been avoided, and I think this is really a very positive step forward. We're not getting hung up on the difference between adaptation and development. We're not spending too much time saying what is mitigation and what isn't, and what is adaptation and what isn't. I think these are very serious sidetracks that we've been too busy with. I also would like to confirm that this idea that climate change responses should importantly contribute to poverty reduction. That's something that IIED and myself have been working on for some time, and one of the reasons why we developed the tracking adaptation measuring development methodology was precisely because we consider that climate responses in terms of adaptation should be measured in terms of their effectiveness in reducing poverty and having developmental outcomes. So the basic tenet of this report we thoroughly agree with. It is a good report. It's a report that reads really well. It's been nicely laid out in different sections. There's something there for people in different sectors, and I hope that will mean that it will get a great deal of readership. One of the things that I think perhaps could have been explained a little better is the difference between the different types of shocks that exist, and not to put too much emphasis on extreme weather events and those sort of short-term sudden onset shocks, but we also need to be thoroughly cognizant of the way that residual effects of climate, extreme weather events, and also the slow onset climate effects need also to be taken into account. So not just the conventional way of thinking about shocks, but shocks that are actually reverberate and in some cases escalate over time. I think it's also important that we get this type of information, the information that tells the ministries of finance that their growth, their economic growth models and strategies are going to be affected by climate change. This, in my experience, governments around the world are actually more interested in growth than they are poverty reduction. We therefore need to be talking in terms of the way that not only that climate will increase the risks to the poor, but also there will be reverberations through the economies, and there will be escalations, transmission effects through economies of climate effects at the local scale, and may well result in differences in economic performance at the national scale. The poverty dynamic data that Stephane showed, and also Paul referred to, that of course can be corroborated from many different countries. I've recently seen very similar data from Uganda and from Ethiopia. And this is the type of information that needs to be shared with those who are sitting in policy-making positions in developing countries. And we need to find ways of doing that as effectively as possible. I wonder, Stephane, whether you could remark on how many leading policymakers across sub-Saharan Africa you expect to be delving into this report, and what ways the bank will actually encourage them and help them to do that. There's also a technical point which has come up here in Mozambique recently. The ministry that is in charge of social protection, which is the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Action, recently decided that they would not measure climate vulnerability as a complement to the way that they deliver social protection. They felt that poverty indicators were more directly related to the objectives that they have, and that climate vulnerability is probably too difficult and too complex to measure, and wouldn't actually increase the efficiency of their social protection processes. And I think that's something that comes out implicitly from this report, which I think is a good thing. Let's move on. Let's get away from the intricacies of climate vulnerability and more onto the ways that we can directly address it. I think there are interesting data in the report, data that should cause people to be really curious. For example, in Ethiopia, where poor people in urban areas are less affected by floods than the better off ones. Now that's a counterintuitive finding. I hope that kind of findings through the report will encourage people not just to read it and to find this new data, but also to think about it and to go and investigate find out whether that data is actually correct, and also find out why it is the case. I was also interested in the terminology of rapid, inclusive, and climate informed. Certainly, that's something that we should be looking for. Something that we should be encouraging governments to take up. Rapid, of course, is intuitively understandable, but actually how we accelerate the processes of development isn't fully explained. I think that's actually an overall comment that I'd like to make about the report. I hope what it will do is to explain to people sort of why and what needs to be done around climate and poverty. But it doesn't go into the minutiae of how, and I understand from what Stephane said that perhaps the national level how to interpret and how to implement what is recommended will happen at a later stage. But certainly I hope that this report will encourage people to agree with the what and the why, but move on quickly to the how. And in terms of how to make development more rapid, how to make it more inclusive, these are huge issues which each country needs to be inquiring after. The ODI 00 report that came out last month makes a fundamental case is that unless we reduce inequality worldwide, we are very unlikely to enable people to have an adaptive capacity that will enable the poorest to escape climate's worst effects. So the how, in terms of how we move to a more inclusive economic growth, and rapidly is an important element, and one that needs further development. And in terms of climate informed, of course, there have been quite a few programs across Africa and elsewhere to improve the climate information services available to decision makers and to people generally. Unfortunately, the take-up of climate information services is relatively poor at the moment. And also the take-up by governments of resources available to invest in climate information services is similarly not as highly demanded as we'd like it to be. The case in point of the ClimDev Africa program is one. where there is a mechanism there which hopefully will encourage sub-Saharan African governments, all African governments, to invest in their climate information services. But so far, relatively few are actually doing that. Sorry. The emphasis of the report in terms of things could be implemented, looking at agriculture, health and social protection, something that we would definitely endorse. IIED's work on radical adaptation has looked at those sectors, but also looked at water, city development and migration. We feel that all of these have the potential to help achieve a further reaching and a farther sighted adaptation or a climate response. The poor who need to escape both climate vulnerability are going to need strategies that are holistic. The planned adaptation, the support by governments to those adaptive strategies needs to be multi-sectorial, needs to be coordinated, or needs to be coherent. So looking at the way that people move, looking at the way that people settle, looking at the provision for those that are left behind and those that are in the destiny locations, looking at the way that agriculture can be supported or water resources can be better regulated. All of these things, as Stephane has said, are part of development, but they're part of development that can contribute to increasing people's ability to cope with climate stresses in the future. There's two final points that I want to make, and these are perhaps a little bit more going to the granular. The report makes mention of climate smart agriculture. Now, climate smart agriculture is something that I've had the pleasure of being able to scrutinize quite closely over the last year due to an evaluation process of the CCAS program. Climate smart agriculture actually hasn't established itself with very, very clear criteria. So to actually talk about it as an entity that then could be adopted massively is probably stretching the point rather. There is work to be done around what actually constitutes climate smart agriculture. Certainly the objectives that it seeks to reach in terms of increasing well-being, increasing adaptive capacity and reducing emissions from agricultural production systems, those three are well understood, well valued, but the trade-offs between them are difficult, and actually getting the adoption levels that would be necessary by poorer farmers is still in doubt. We want to look at the WDR, the World Development Report from 2014, the background paper by Brown et al., which looks at barriers to adoption. This is it provides a lot of information as to why there is lack of adoption of what would seem to be economically viable and positive technologies by poor families. Similarly, in the case of social protection, there is a move these days to look at social protection as an instrument that can also render climate resilience benefits. I'm here in Mozambique looking at this question currently, and actually looking at the way that social protection programs are being delivered here in Mozambique, looking at the capacity levels that there are to achieve the laudable objectives of lifting people out of poverty, and then to perhaps overburden them with climate resilience objectives is probably not wise at this stage. There are ways perhaps to do this better, perhaps looking at social protection as one layer or one part of a sequence of provision that would mean that poverty and climate vulnerability.
Simon?
Yes.
Hello, Simon. I'm sorry, we're really running late. Can I ask you to conclude?
Yes, that was my final point. Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this webinar.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, your comments have been very, very useful, and I'm pretty sure that it will stimulate further questions and remarks from the audience. In the meanwhile, I'll give the floor back to Stephane. Stephane, do you have any comment and reaction to both Paul and Simon's comments?
So very briefly, because we want to keep time for the rest, I won't go into everything, but I want mostly to acknowledge all the limits that were raised by the two discussants. For a lot of what they say, we just agree on climate smart agriculture and the need to do much more work on this, on the fact that on migration and fragility we have very little, even though you can imagine that one big country collapsing because of natural disasters would be enough to multiply our number by 2 or 3, just with one big shock at one point. So a lot of the points made were really, really good points, and we want to work more on all of these elements. The only thing that I will just say 2 words about are the value of ecosystems, because I realized I did not mention it in my presentation. We use some of the PEN data sets to look at the role of ecosystem services in reducing poverty, and we find a huge impact. In some places, poverty would be 15% higher if you remove all of the ecosystem income that is just like getting food and roots in the forest, for instance. And these ecosystems are threatened by climate change, and this is something that we have very little quantification of, but might be very important for the very poor, especially indigenous population. This is something we mentioned but did not appear in the presentation, so I just wanted to flag this, because one of the fear we can have for the next decades is to have more and more of these pockets of extreme poverty in countries that are more and more affluent. And these pockets of poverty will be in remote places, very dependent on ecosystems that will be threatened by climate change. So even if the number of people is small, it doesn't mean that it's not a huge impact for them, and the welfare consequences could be really, really high. So this is an important point that was mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephane. I would rather move immediately to the questions, because we have many questions from the audience, and it's important to give the audience the chance to get a feedback from you. The first one is on employment. The question comes from Raya Benova, and it says, as decent employment is one of the most secure and productive ways out of poverty, do you reckon that employment programs for vulnerable people should be upscaled across the poorest regions and segments of population? Furthermore, what do you reckon is the place of green jobs in this context?
So when we discuss social protection, public work programs play a big role. They play a big role for many different reasons. First, they can be put in place very rapidly. So when you have a shock, the question for a government is how to increase support for the affected population. And you really have to be quick. We look at numbers in the report showing that if the support is delayed just by a few months, you get all of the coping options you don't want to see, like children getting out of school and sometimes never getting back. You see the children lacking food and having development issues that can be permanent. So support should be really quick, and we have plenty of evidence that one of the social protection instruments that can be put in place very quickly are public works. And they have another advantage, which is that the targeting can be done by people themselves. So one of the big challenges after a disaster is to provide help to the people who need help. And in places where you don't have a strong social protection infrastructure, it's really difficult to do so. With public work programs, by setting the wage at the right level, you can have this self-selection process where people who are going there are people who really need support. So this is something that we discuss at length. In terms of the link with green jobs, we find that in Ethiopia, for instance, where the productive safety net program is efficient in protecting people against drought and is based on a public work program, a lot of the projects that people get to work on are projects linked with water management or disaster risk management. So they can be labeled as green jobs. And we know that these social protection work programs will be even more efficient if the projects that people are working on are projects that build the resilience, build the development capacity. So I think that green jobs have a big role to play into this. It doesn't mean that all projects need to be labeled green, but there are some opportunities to do that, and some countries are capturing them already. So I invite you to look at the examples we use even in post-conflict situation, these work programs have been found extremely efficient.
Thank you. Second question comes from Sheila Patterson. How much does the environment factor in good development and influence global financing, for example, to protected areas, sustainable use of natural resources, ecological infrastructure, and ensuring ecosystems remain healthy to continue to provide goods and services?
So, I mean, how important is the environment? I think looking at the shocks, the nature of the shocks that keep people in poverty is enough to show how the environment is important. So this report is on climate and poverty, but a lot of what we talk about could be relabeled environment and poverty. And I was talking a little bit earlier about the role of the services that ecosystem provide. The only way to help ecosystems adapt to climate change is to remove the other stressors. So all of the conservation policies that tries to protect ecosystem and make them healthier and better able to cope with other changes are adaptation policies for ecosystems and might make them more able to continue to provide all of these free services that are so important for many of poor people. Again, if we're looking at the poorest, at least in the sites looked at by the PEN database, about 30% of the income or the consumption of people are directly taken from ecosystems. So the role cannot be underestimated. So this really calls for the inclusion of the environment and ecosystem and into development policies. And the role of the valuation of these to convince people is, of course, something that we discuss a lot. We have this program WAVES that is trying to do that in many countries to, again, make the case that sometimes it's cheaper and more efficient to protect an ecosystem and keep the services rather than letting the ecosystem go and trying to replace the services with hard infrastructure or more investment. So, again, this is not really new, but this is maybe showing the role of taking environment into account in development patterns with a different angle, the angle of extreme poverty.
Perhaps I could just interject one extra point. I mean, I think the role of environment and infrastructure is still very underestimated and underplayed in terms of the development of new cities. We're going through a second urbanization revolution at the moment. Some 50% of the urban infrastructure that will exist in 2050 still has to be built. And if it is not built in a resource and energy efficient way, then any chance of meeting the carbon reduction targets and keeping within 2 degrees with all that implies is likely to be missed. And it seems to me that very often we focus on rural development when we're talking about these things, and in a way that's right, because probably climate will have its biggest impacts in rural areas, but at the same time this urbanization trend that we're seeing, it has to be done in a climate-friendly way, otherwise we don't stand a chance of meeting the carbon target.
Next question by Francisco Burgos. Development can be a great tool for climate change management, but you don't think such development need to be different from the mainstream development that is in place today? Quite difficult question.
No, but I think so. This is an opportunity also to answer to Simon's point about the how this can be done. One thing that I might not have stressed enough in the presentation is that we're not saying that any development will do. We're not saying that we can just like run straight and kind of beat climate change because we would get to a development point in which we don't care. I want to repeat now that we were looking at the impact of climate change on poverty. We're not saying that good development can prevent all impacts. Even in the optimistic scenarios we have, we find that the impact on poverty is much reduced. It doesn't mean that climate change doesn't have an economic impact and an impact on the non-poor. So it's really important to look at how development needs to happen and how to do it. And I tend to agree with the discussion that rapid development, everybody like it, and there are entire reports written about how to accelerate development and economic growth. And this was not the objective of this report, to add to this literature on how to accelerate development. One thing that we try to stress in the report is the need for inclusiveness. So the fact that among the people most vulnerable, we find people who are not benefiting a lot from current development trends. In many countries, even when you have decent economic growth, you have pockets of poverty, especially in remote places where incomes are not growing. And if we want to eradicate extreme poverty, the goal of the international community, and if we want to reduce vulnerability to climate change, we need to bring the right type of development to these pockets of poverty. And this is an entirely different challenge than what we are talking about when we talk about development. This is why we focus a lot on redistribution, social protection, and health, access to health, including health insurance and coverage, because we feel this is really a proven way of making development more inclusive. And we have plenty of examples in many countries where cash transfers and access to social insurance made a difference by making development more inclusive. The last thing in terms of how different development should be is this climate informed. So as you can imagine, we had some back and forth in the team between climate smart, climate informed, etc. We picked climate informed because we feel that even in projects that have no relationship with climate, there is one condition that all development projects should have, is not to create new risks. And if you look at urbanization, and Paul was talking about this wave of urbanization, this is also a fantastic window of opportunity to make sure what we build today doesn't need retrofit or costly protection later on. So there is really a challenge to build right in the first place, instead of building like quick and thinking that we will be richer and able to cope with the consequences later. This is not a full answer to the question. If I had the full answer to this question, most problems of the world would be solved. But in the report, we're really trying to give some examples of countries who did things to make their development more inclusive, or taking into account in a better way of the future really great risks of climate change.
Excellent. Another question by Gideon Kruzman, who is asking something more specific about climate shock resilient crops, because you said a target adaptation intervention such as on climate shock resilient crops require long-term investment in agricultural research. The tendency, however, has been that the agricultural research investment are going down. Doesn't this imply a less optimistic takeaway?
Yeah, so in the report we have a full chapter on agriculture, and one thing that we really stress is the role of the assumptions in the models on how these better crops will appear and how technical change will be generated and applied on the ground. These assumptions really drive a lot of the results in terms of food security. They're not the only thing, like diets, for instance, are also very important, but assumptions about new technologies and innovation are really, really important. And there is sort of a gap between what you see in models with, rational behaviors and so on, more investments in R&D and innovation in heat-tolerant crops and progress on that. At the same time, we see that productivity has been plateauing in many world regions, and that we don't have a lot of investments going into the tropical crops that we need to do this. So, I mean, whether this changes something to the optimistic takeaway, I mean, probably. One thing that we acknowledge is the fact that we're not there yet. There are a lot of things that need to change if we want to get to this pathway that combines reduction in emissions with resilience building and development. And the need for innovation to go to the right place is one of the things that we flag for agriculture, but also for health. I mentioned it during my talk. And for this, this will not happen by itself. Only policies will make that happen. This is something we say very, very strongly. And again, there are many reports and work on innovation and how to trigger more innovation and more investment from private actors. And we're not trying to replace this literature, but we want to flag the fact that if you're interested in climate, you probably want to read these reports on how to trigger more innovation in places with low income or in tropical agriculture.
Among innovation, and one that you mentioned in the report is it concerns financial inclusion. And I have a question from Andreas Martinez. Can financial inclusion mitigate the risks faced by poor people living in areas affected by climate change? What's the role? How can financial inclusion address these risks?
So there are basically two main factors for which financial inclusion is building the resilience of the population. First, it helps people save in a way that's not vulnerable. So we have in the household surveys where we follow some households as they try to escape poverty, we find, for instance, that in Latin America, the pathway of asset accumulation in urban areas starts with the house. The first thing people do when they're very, very poor is each time they can save a little bit, they improve their dwelling. And they do that because the priority is health, safety, and security, and you need a house and a dwelling that's as good as possible to do that. So the first investments are there, and all of the resources are going there. And before they do that, people have no way of putting a little bit aside in case of shocks that would destroy the house. There is also this behavioral literature showing that people save by improving their dwelling because they know that if they keep cash, it's very likely that cash will be spent in the household. So it's also a way to make sure this is actually saved. We have evidence of financial inclusion, for instance, using mobile banking, but also saving instruments that fit the needs of poor people. So it's not only that you need access, you need specific products designed for poor people. For instance, products that can accept very small amounts, products that can be used very quickly in case of a shock, with predetermined saving patterns to help people save and so on. And where it worked, the government did not only invest in financial inclusion. It invested in financial inclusion for poor people with the appropriate product, and in most cases private banks are not. These guys don't have a lot of resources, so you have to force banks to be allowed to operate. They have to offer products for poor people. And you also need consumer protection designed for poor people, because there is a trust issue. Poor people don't use banks because they don't trust them. So they need to have this protection. So we're looking at in the report at how this can happen, and it's not only providing access to finance. It's providing the right type of instruments for poor people, and this can be very different from the middle class needs, and this again requires specific regulations.
Another question, probably more general, comes from Sabine Goulden about the speed of development of low carbon technology. She believes it's too slow, and it's the problem comes from the power of fossil fuel lobbies and national interest to use fossil fuel, domestic fossil fuel resources. How can we deal with these power conflicts?
So, I mean, of course, development of this technology is too slow. I mean, at least we would like it to be faster. At the same time, I want to reemphasize what Paul said a little bit earlier, the fact that we have made fantastic progress in these technologies, and the reduction in costs that we observe was really not expected 10 years ago. And if you see investments taking place today, people would have laughed at you if you had said that this would occur like only 10 years ago. But I want to flag one issue that we have today is we have technologies, green technologies, that are competitive or almost competitive if you look at the economic analysis of the different technologies. But we have to keep in mind that in many countries, governments and the private sector, especially small and medium enterprises, when they select technologies, they don't look at the best economic option, because their constraint is the ability to invest. So they look at upfront costs. If you cannot access financial instruments, upfront costs become much more important. And we have a lot of cases where countries are going to lower efficiency technologies because they have this trade-off to make, and they accept higher operational costs to reduce upfront costs. So we have to keep in mind that because all green technologies, it's always technologies that are more expensive at the investment stage and less expensive when you use the technology. So there are technologies that require more financing. And if we want the technologies we have already to be better implemented, financing is really one of the key. To get to the lobbying thing, we're not getting so much into this in this report, but we had this report 6 months ago called Decarbonizing Development, where we had an entire chapter on the political economy of the green transition. And what we said in this report is that when we do green or climate policies, we want to protect poor people against the shock because this is the right thing to do. And sometimes we want to help some sectors and so on, even if they don't deserve it, but just because that's a price to pay to make the policy acceptable and possible. So this lobbying exists. We have to acknowledge it, and we have to just take care of it. We looked at past experience of trade liberalization, which in a sense is creating something very similar to the introduction of carbon pricing. You have some sectors benefit and some sectors are losing. And how do you manage the distributional impact of that? And we were looking at the different policies helping companies invest in better technologies and helping workers not only cope with the shock, but also transition, moving from the losing sectors to the winning sectors. Basically, we had two conclusions. One is that we have a toolbox to do this, and the US, Japan, and Europe especially have been doing that a lot to cope with the consequences of trade liberalization. And we have to recognize that this exists and to, work on the political economy, because the main obstacle today to the green transition is not the macroeconomic costs. It's the political economy linked to very concentrated costs in some sectors or some regions.
Can I just add to that, Carlo, because it seems to me that we must be clear that technology is not just a technical artifact. It's very closely linked to a country's institutions. It's very closely linked to habits, norms, behaviors of the population, and that's one of the reasons why these technologies tend to diffuse quite slowly, and one of the reasons why social innovation and institutional innovation is every bit as important in terms of speeding up the diffusion of these technical innovations as the technical innovation itself.
We have 3 more minutes and a lot of questions. I really apologize we are unable to address all questions, but at least 2 more. One is about the role of the private sector. So what is the role of private sector in addressing poverty reduction? The question comes from Teye Teferi. And what are the impacts of climate change on development and growth of private sector-led businesses, in particular in rural Africa? But just 1 minute, Stephane.
So, the role of the private sector, we have a lot of the recommendations we're making in the report are for action by governments in terms of policies, but a lot of the actual work would be done by the private sector, even in sectors where you wouldn't expect it. So for social protection, for instance, when Pakistan was affected by the flood in 2010, the the support provided to the affected population went through private banks because they had the network and so on. So we really show that the fact that public-private partnerships can be very efficient tools to deliver support to the population, and the private sector has a role to play in the sense that they can also benefit and create activities and jobs and something that we want to see growing in these countries. Whether climate change can slow down the private sector development, when there are 2 questions. One question is on the impacts of climate change, and clearly this is the case in some sectors like agriculture and so on. And there is the question of how low energy price support the development of the private sector, and whether increasing the cost of energy because of climate policy would slow down this. To be honest, we find no evidence that the private sector is growing less rapidly with higher energy prices. This seems to be very secondary compared with institutions and other factors of competitiveness and productivity. So we don't think that this would be a big concern, especially if carbon taxes, for instance, were compensated by reduced taxes in other sectors.
Final question, and for the three of you, a final statement, because one of the conclusions of the report is that we need a political will to stimulate policy action. So what steps would you recommend? How do you see in particular the Paris COP21 to address this issue? What kind of political will and what steps to induce the political will? Simon, really 30 seconds.
Well, we've heard recently that 140 heads of state will be in Paris at one stage, probably towards the beginning of the COP. That shows some level of political will. And I think that the fact that we're having these discussions and the information that the World Bank and others are generating should be convincing. So the question is, how do we get it into the right hands and in the right way?
And Paul?
Countries have political will when they perceive that there is something that can benefit their societies. And the big turnaround in the whole climate change debate over the last 5 years is that climate change is now perceived to be a potential economic and social opportunity as opposed to a cost, which leads to discussions about burden sharing. Whether we're talking about co-benefits, whether we're talking about technological developments, whether we're talking about low carbon and green jobs, there are opportunities out there now which were not there even just a few years ago, and that is what is going to generate political will in Paris.
Thank you. Stephane?
So very quickly, two things. First, everything I said in this report is also dependent on the governance system, and we say very clearly that in countries where there is no willingness to support poor people and where poor people have no voice, it's very unlikely that they will receive the support they need. So, I mean, we're talking about policies and so on, but if there is no voice to poor people, we won't succeed. So this is really something that we need to keep pushing for, giving a voice to poor people. Hopefully this report can help put some evidence on the table that then they can use. And finally, what we wanted to achieve with the report is really to remind everybody at the COP, head of states and everybody else, that people are not meeting in Paris just to stabilize climate change. They are meeting in Paris because we want prosperity, we want to eradicate poverty, and this is the end goal of everything we're doing on climate. This is really what we're trying to achieve, and hopefully this can help with the political will to really frame climate as one of the things we have to achieve along with education and the rest if we want to eradicate poverty forever.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Time is over. I'm really sorry, and I apologize for those who are raising additional questions. I'm pretty sure that you will find an answer in the report, so you will have time and probably you will find the answer you're looking for by reading the report or by attending future webinars or by going to the GGKP website, where you will find a lot of information about all these issues. So let me thank all those who have been participating in the webinar, in particular the audience. Let me thank the two discussants. Let me thank in particular Stephane Hallegatte for his excellent presentation, and see all of you or many of you in Paris next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.